Alrighty, welcome back everyone to another one of the best whatever type of campaign in Warhammer 3. And today I'm going to talk about the best missile or ranged faction. So this is another one where you've got a lot of really good choices. There are quite a few factions that do excel in terms of ranged, and I'm going to talk about a few of the honorable mentions. I'm not going to go through literally all of the ones that have good ranged combat because there are really so many of them, but I do want to say a quick words of intro at the beginning before talking about the one that I think provides for the best campaign that is a very heavily oriented towards ranged combat. So anyway, let's talk about, first of all, a couple of important points to make at the very beginning. This is vanilla, where I do the assessment of these different factions. Although, as many of you who follow my Let's Plays know, that I tend to use a lot of mods to try to turn the vanilla game into a much longer, grand epic paced marathon type of campaign. And of course, the same evaluations should pretty much apply when you're using those as well. I do play on Legendary very hard, and so that's what my assessment is based on. But again, I don't think playing on the other difficulties is going to really impact this type of an evaluation either. So let's talk about some of the honorable mentions here, because like I said, there are quite a few factions that do have really good ranged campaigns. I'm just going to pick the one that I think is the absolute best. So when it comes to Warhammer 3, ranged units are still extremely good. They're not quite as OP as they were in Warhammer 2. Warhammer 2, you could get away with a lot more of building armies that were almost entirely based on ranged units. It's a little bit harder to do that because melee is just really a little bit better off in a better situation in Warhammer 3. But again, ranged units obviously still very, very powerful. And I always do, when I do my Warhammer 3 campaigns, I always do manual battles as much as possible. So I'm not really taking into consideration how effective these different units are in auto-resolve. I just think that the game gets boring way too quickly when I do auto-resolves. So that's how I always play. And that's what these evaluations are based on. So, oh, and I almost forgot to mention, there's one other really important factor to consider, not just in this, but in all the evaluations that I do, because this has come up before in some of the comments, and I really should have made this a lot more explicit when I was making the previous videos, but I do not necessarily equate best with most powerful. So it is certainly a factor. You know, if you want to have the best heroes, I'm going to go back to the one I did previously, the best heroes campaign, certainly your heroes, and I mentioned this, that your heroes need to be playing a very important role in your campaign, but I did not mean to suggest that this is the absolute most powerful heroes in the game. What I instead meant is sort of an overall experience where your heroes feel really strong. You have lots of variety, lots of versatility, and lots of theme. You know, there's just a lot of different factors that go into these evaluations when I say best. You know, so I'm sort of talking quality of life is another important one. So I would just say, you know, best all around takes into consideration a lot of different factors. Well, the same thing is true when we're talking about the best missile campaign. So we want to have a campaign not only where your ranged units are very strong, but they, you know, there's some variety, there's a number of different units. So let's talk about, I think, the three main points for evaluating a missile unit campaign. I think for it to be a really interesting, fun missile unit campaign, you want to have at your disposal lots of missile units that are modified by your technology tree, modified by your faction, modified by your legendary lord. So if there's a faction that inherently has benefits to their missile units, that's great. And then if on top of that they have a legendary lord that provides additional buffs to their units, to their ranged units, then that might make that particular legendary lord the best of that race, if that makes sense. So there are any number of legendary lords that do provide buffs to their ranged units, and so we're going to talk about some of those. But first of all, let's go through the rest of the major factors involved with a good missile unit campaign. The second factor I think that's really important for it to be a good missile unit campaign is you want your missile units to be playing a very important role in the early game, in the mid game, and in the late game. So in other words, throughout your campaign, you don't want to have just them strong in the early game, but then before too long you want to move on to better units, and all of a sudden your missile units start to taper off in terms of their effectiveness. Likewise, you don't want to have a really long early game before they ramp up and start to have some usefulness in your campaign. And then the third thing that I think is pretty important is, because there's a time and a place for both of these, is to have ranged units that can do both direct fire and indirect fire. And in particular, I think when we're talking about that, we want to think about the difference between, let's talk about the dwarves, for example. So the difference between crossbowmen and thunderers, for example. So thunderers are a gunpowder unit. They fire straight ahead of them. They have a lot of difficulty firing over the heads of your own units, whereas quarrelers can fire a little bit more indirectly up into the air over the heads of your own units down into the enemy. And that makes a big difference in terms of how you deploy them on the battlefield. So you have to deploy your gunpowder units so that they have a clear line of sight and they can fire straight ahead, whereas there's a little bit more versatility with your quarrelers and other types of arcing fire so that you can shoot over the heads of your units. Likewise, the same is true with artillery. Artillery tends to be a little bit more indirect fire and can fire up into the air, raining death down upon your enemies, some more so than others. So you've got mortars, the difference between mortars and cannons, for example. So hopefully that makes sense. And the reason that I think it's important to include both direct and indirect fire is because both of those, there is a time and a place for both of those on the battlefield. Okay, enough of a preamble here. Let's go ahead and jump into some of the honorable mention. And since we're already here on the dwarfs, let's talk about them first. So in terms of the dwarfs obviously have a lot of really good ranged units. They do have good missile infantry. They also have very good artillery. A lot of this has been added in DLCs recently, so they're in a really good place right now, I think, overall, and they're definitely a very good option. Of the different legendary lords for the dwarfs, I think that Thorek is probably the obvious choice in terms of who is strongest with missile units. Malachi as well, but because some of the new missile units are Slayer units, in fact. But I still think that the fact that Thorek buffs Quarrelers is such a strong early game unit, the Quarrelers are, that he's obviously a very good choice. But he's merely an honorable mention in this list because there is at least one who is better than he is. Let's talk about some of the others here. I think obviously, let's talk about the High Elves. Actually, I'm going to really quickly mention the Wood Elves. The Wood Elves are fantastic missile units. The kind of the shame of 3 of the 4 of them is that they don't really provide any buffs to your Elven missile units. The only one that provides any buffs at all, really, are the Sisters of Twilight. So they're a good choice. The Wood Elf missile units are very strong. I particularly love the fact that so many of them can fire while moving, which is a really, really strong ability. But they're a little bit lacking in terms of having a legendary lord that really buffs. Right here, you got a little bit of an upkeep advantage for the Sisters of Twilight with missile units, but not any real like missile strength buffs or anything like that. So always fun to play with the missile units and Wood Elves, but they're lacking many of the buffs that some of the other races have to really boost these guys in combat. High Elves are also another good choice. They've got some really good ranged units, and you do have a few of your Legendary Lords that provide some nice little buffs. You got some hybrid units that are kind of good. Obviously, Tyrion does provide an upkeep debuff to some of your lower tier units, which can be extremely handy. There's lots of good Legendary Lords here. I think the obvious choice in terms of the best one for missile unit combat in Warhammer 3 is Alariel. And even though they're not nearly as strong as they were in Warhammer 2, I do think the Sisters of Avalorn are still a good unit. Handmaidens are still good heroes. So really, if you like the elves a lot, you could have an Alariel campaign and get good value out of your missile units in her campaign. But she's not the best, and that'll become apparent here in a moment. So another really good option here. You've always got the Vampire Coast. They have lots of pretty good missile units. The fact that they've got a lot of choices between artillery and really low tier and sort of medium tier gunnery units, they're a good option for variety and versatility in terms of your missile units. But I kind of feel like these are, I'm not sure what the right word is. They're a little bit more difficult to work with on the battlefield than some of the other choices are. But again, flavor-wise, these guys are very flavorful and are quite good. And then finally, the last honorable mention that I want to talk about, and to me, this would be the runner-up in terms of providing really good missile unit campaigns. That would be Ikit. Ikit has really, really fun ranged unit-oriented combat, mainly because of their access to the Forbidden Workshop. The Forbidden Workshop can have, provide real value, real buffs to your Warlock Jezzails, which are probably my favorite unit, maybe in the entire game, but certainly one of my favorite units for the Skaven. The Rattling Guns are extremely powerful, another favorite of mine. Not quite the range of the Jezzails, but really, really effective if you can keep them protected. They just mow down the enemies. So really fun to buff these units, and you can do that. You can provide them real benefits in the Forbidden Workshop. They have access, obviously, to the other Skaven ranged units. You've got your Poison Wind Globadiers, things like that. So there's some really strong units in the Skaven roster as well, and the fact that you can really buff them up with the Forbidden Workshop really makes Ikit the best in terms of the Skaven at providing a really good missile unit campaign. All that being said, there's another one. Oh, I forgot to mention also the Warplock Engineer. Or is it, I guess it's Warlock Engineer, excuse me. The Warlock Engineer provides really good benefits to the missile units, really good buffs to the missile units. Sort of like, and I forgot to mention this with the Dwarfs, have access to a unit that also buffs their missile units. But there is another race that has basically almost all of the same advantages that the Skaven have in terms of having a hero that buffs their missile units, having a lot of variety in terms of their different types of missile units, and also has something very similar to the Forbidden Workshop that provides a lot of buffs to a lot of your different missile units as well. And those of you who have the latest DLC probably already know where I'm going with this. It is, of course, Elspeth. So Elspeth, I think, overall is the top choice for having a very ranged unit-oriented campaign, a very missile unit-heavy campaign. She's got access to so many things that boost your missile units. It is absolutely amazing. The Imperial Gunnery School is basically like a supercharged version of your laboratory that Ikit has access to, which boosts his missile units. The only thing that he gets that she doesn't get is access to the nuke, which is, that's a serious consideration, but I don't really think of the nuke as a missile unit. It's just a really powerful battlefield spell that you can cast every once in a while. But in terms of being able to boost all of your units on the battlefield, this right here is your absolute number one choice. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the campaign. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the strategy for her campaign because, quite frankly, her campaign is not really all that difficult. It's really quite a straightforward campaign, but we'll talk a little bit about it. I'll just provide a little bit of basic advice and show how it tends to play out, and then show some examples of what I mean by her faction being really so strong in terms of missile units. So right away in Elspeth's campaign, the first thing that you want to pay attention to is, of course, the Imperial Gunnery School, and the Gunnery School allows you to provide not one, not two, but 3 upgraded buffs to 8 different units. So like I said, basically the supercharged version of the workshop that Ickeclaw gets. So definitely something that is very useful all the way from the very, very beginning of your campaign all the way through mid-game and into late game. You can really buff up your units, and will continue to do so throughout the entire Elspeth campaign. The other thing to talk about in terms of her campaign and why I said that it's a pretty straightforward campaign here is that you start out with not one but 2 different minor factions to fight against at the very beginning of the game before you have to start worrying about going up against other major factions. So it gives you an opportunity to expand fairly considerably just within the first few turns in order to give yourself a really good foundation, a really good starting point for then deciding how you want to continue your campaign moving forward. So the standard way of playing an Elspeth campaign is to just make nice with the other Imperial factions to secure your northern border, so you really don't have to worry about any defenses up in that direction, and that allows you to focus on moving south with your main army and eastward then as well. So pretty casual, pretty laid back, chill type of a campaign here in the early going. In terms of the skills that I would recommend, I personally have become a really big fan of taking the blue line for starters. In particular with Elspeth, I like having Lightning Strike because before too long you will probably find yourself at war with Sylvania. Sylvania will come at you with multiple armies. It's always very, very nice to be able to take on those armies one at a time. Otherwise, they can kind of wear you down just with sheer numbers. Their units are not particularly strong in the early going, so as long as you don't let them overwhelm you with numbers, you should be fine. Now, as I mentioned, the engineer hero unit, really, really good at buffing your missile units, so that's a real strength of an Imperial and in particular an Elspeth campaign. You also have access to the Master Engineer Lord, same thing, provides really good value for a missile-oriented campaign. Every fight, every battle you win provides you with some schematics, which are the currency that you use to upgrade the units in your workshop. In your gunnery school, not to be confused with Ickett's workshop. So just make sure you're fighting lots of battles and you should have lots of schematics, and the buffs should mount up very, very quickly. In terms of your tech tree, you probably want to lean very heavily on buffing your infantry first. I like having a little bit of a strong front line, so I actually focused first of all on the melee infantry. But like I said here, there's right from the very beginning, you've got technologies that will buff your missile units as well. Black Venom, the minor greenskins faction, which will very likely be your second opponent after you wipe out the minor vampire count faction that you start out at war against. Anyway, Black Venom is at war with Averland already, so right after you wipe out your first opponent, makes sense to go ahead and go to war with these guys. They're already at war with Averland, so you just talk to Averland, get a little bit of money from Averland to boost your economy a little bit in order to go to war with them as well. Another really nice advantage of her early campaign is you don't really have to worry too much about defending at all, so you can just expand, just occupy these settlements right after you win battles against them, and you shouldn't really have too much to worry about. And like I said, after you finish wiping out the minor factions to your south and establish a pretty good foundation for your burgeoning empire, you will probably find yourself going to war with Sylvania next. Still, you don't have to worry too much about your northern border or your west, so you can basically just focus all of your armies against Sylvania. They've got some decent units. Vlad and Isabel are, relatively strong in terms of the early game, but I like Lightning Strike because you can pretty much get yourself in a one-on-one fight of Elspeth's army against Vlad's army, and you should be able to win that. Their units, for the most part, are pretty weak in the early going, and then frankly, once you knock their main army out, the rest of their armies tend to be pretty much rubbish, so not really too difficult to keep pushing them back. Again, you can expand fairly aggressively. You don't have to worry too much about defending your settlements as you expand, but you don't want to get too carried away. Just make sure that you're being intelligent about your expansion. Just keep the pressure on Sylvania. You should be in pretty good shape. If you want to, after taking a couple of their settlements, they will very quickly be willing to pay you off for peace, which in my case, they would be willing to give me a little bit more than 5,000 gold, which is a lot of money here in the early campaign, to have peace with them. Do that if you want to. If you want to, maybe have a different kind of an Elspeth campaign and go off in a different direction. Or if you just want a little bit of time to regroup and build up your infrastructure or something like that, the money is always nice. I don't think it's really necessary. I think there's really no reason to make peace with them. You can just keep the pressure on them, keep taking their settlements from them, keep defeating their zombie-filled armies fairly handily. And as long as you keep getting your schematics, you keep buffing your units in the gunnery school, you'll very quickly have the advantage over Sylvania and really probably be able to expand into one of the larger early game empires in the campaign. I haven't really talked about her gardens mechanic or her spell casting in battle. Both of those things are important to an Elspeth campaign, but they're not really all that related to missile units. So, just have some fun with those. She's a pretty effective lord, both on the campaign map and in battle, so nothing particularly special going on there. But again, the main thing to keep in mind is you want as many schematics as possible to keep boosting your units in your gunnery school here. You want to be building the foundry building as quickly as possible so you can level up your gunnery school's level. Again, just stay on top of boosting the units that you like, the units that you have in your armies. You've got lots and lots of variety here, as you can see, a whole lot of different units, including regiments of renown, but really ranged units of every stripe are available to be buffed here in the gunnery school. So really allows you to, pick whichever your favorite units are and focus on them, or just, buff everything. There's such a wide range of units at your disposal. So, and like I said, also, use your engineers and your master engineers to provide their additional buffs to your missile units as well. And there's just so many buffs that you can give to your missile units overall. That is really the power of your missile units in this type of a campaign. And so there you have it. I think overall she's a fairly easy choice. I think that this is a pretty objective evaluation of all of the different legendary lords and races that have really good ranged campaigns. I think you can see why she makes overall the best ranged unit campaign. So again, she's got really, really strong buffs, whether you're talking about the heroes that provide a benefit, provide buffs to your missile units, whether you're talking about the technology tree providing benefits to your units, and also, of course, the gunnery school providing benefits, buffs to your units. There's just a lot you can do to improve your missile units overall. These are definitely, you've got such variety in your different units that they are certainly valuable to your armies all throughout the campaign, early, mid, late game. And of course, you've got access to lots and lots of both direct and indirect fire missile units. So there you go. I think hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully you can see that she's a very good choice for a campaign that's going to focus very heavily on those. Now, again, as always, I welcome your comments. I'm sure that some of you have some pretty strong opinions on other legendary lords, other factions, other races, other units that I didn't talk about here that are extremely good, and I welcome all that discussion, so please feel free to add your comments. And I think I will go ahead and leave it at that. I'm not sure which one of these I'm going to do next, but I'm having fun just kind of going through. And even though I don't play on vanilla all that much myself, it is kind of good to just sort of set a baseline for which factions are really good at different things. So if you have any ideas in particular for a different type of play style campaign that you'd like to see me do a video on, I have a few more ideas, but please feel free to share your own ideas about that as well. All right, well, anyway, thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I will see you in the next video.